The wind came first, a long, dry moan sweeping down from the Sangre de Cristo mountains, stirring the dust on the empty platform like restless spirits. If you're new here, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. The station at Esperanza was little more than a sun-bleached shack and a rusting water tower, crouched low against the horizon as if bracing for some old grudge the land still carried. The rails stretched away on either side like dark scars pressed into the ochre earth. Heat shimmered off them in ghostly waves. Caleb Mercer sat his horse a few yards from the platform, his broad hat pulled low, his weathered face carved in shadow. The leather creaked softly as he shifted in the saddle, though his posture was stiff as a church pew. He had shaved for the first time in weeks, though the cut on his jaw still stung. His eyes, the color of worn gunmetal, stayed fixed on the far bend of the tracks. Somewhere beyond that bend, a train dragged a woman he had never met halfway across the country, and toward the hollow place he called home. He told himself this was just business, a practical solution. The ranch needed steady hands and a quiet presence. He needed order, not affection, not the entangling softness that had once nearly drowned him. But even as he thought it, a pulse of unease thudded in his chest like hoofbeats in the dark. The train's whistle tore through the stillness, a long, mournful cry that made the jackrabbits scatter from the sagebrush. Iron wheels screamed against the rails as the locomotive rounded the curve, belching cinders into the white sky. Caleb's grip tightened on the reins. The knot in his stomach pulled hard as the train shuddered to a halt in a plume of steam. Doors banged open. Passengers spilled onto the platform. A clutch of miners with soot still ground into their necks. A pair of schoolmarms fanning themselves with folded timetables. A preacher clutching his Bible like it might bolt. And then, she stepped down, a slight figure, not frail but coiled, moving with the wary grace of a Mustang that had learned the hard way not to trust fences. Her traveling dress was simple, dust-streaked from the journey, but her posture cut through the station air like a drawn blade. A battered valise hung from her hand. Black hair, loose from its pins, glinted blue in the hard sunlight. Her eyes were the first thing that caught him. Dark, luminous, unflinching. Caleb forgot to breathe. Around her, the chatter of the platform dulled. Townsfolk slowed, stared, and then began their murmuring. "Mexicana," someone spat low, as if the syllables were something foul. Another man, one of Grady's drovers, snorted and muttered, "A half-blood brought in by that Mercer fool." Isobel Santiago heard them. Caleb saw the flick of her gaze, saw how she held her chin a fraction higher, as though bracing against a storm she'd known would come. And when her eyes found him, they didn't falter. Not once. She walked toward him like she wasn't walking into a stranger's life, but reclaiming something stolen. Caleb swung down from the saddle. His boots hit the boards with a heavy thud that made the nearest children flinch. He removed his hat. The air between them was dry as powder. "Miss Santiago," he said. "Senora," she corrected, voice low but even. "I keep my father's name." The sound of her accent, Rio Grande lilt sharpened by schooling, cut through him. Not timid, not meek, not the pliant bride he had ordered with banknotes sealed in an envelope. For a long moment they just stood, studying one another. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow sliding over the dirt. "Your trunk?" Caleb asked. "This is it," she said, lifting the scuffed valise. Everything else burned. Her words landed like stones in a well. He nodded once and turned toward his horse before he could ask what had burned, or who. Some wounds didn't belong to strangers. He hoisted her up behind him, her hands light and careful on the saddle horn. The smell of her hair, dust and sun-warmed sage, cut through the sweat and leather and old fear that clung to him. They rode out of town under a sky gone white with heat. Behind them, whispers followed like gnats. They passed the last crooked fences, the dry creek bed, the blackened husks of old cavalry outposts. The land opened wide around them, rolling brown mesas fractured by canyons, the far blue ghosts of mountains rising like old gods on the horizon. The only sound was the creak of leather, the slow clop of hooves, and the rasp of the wind dragging over the plain. Caleb's mind drifted to the house awaiting them. Stone walls baked to cracking, empty rooms, silence thick as grief. He had imagined her voice filling those rooms, soft and obedient. Instead, he sensed she would rattle the bones of the place. Maybe of him too. When the sun sank lower, slanting red light across the range, she finally spoke. "You didn't expect me," she said. Caleb kept his eyes forward. "No. Do you want to send me back?" The question knifed the air. He almost said yes, but the truth caught in his throat like a dry seed. No, he said. Not now you're here. Neither of them looked at the other. The horses carried them into the falling dusk, two strangers bound by ink and desperation, riding toward a house built on silence. But something in the wind had changed, and Caleb Mercer felt it in his bones, like the first tremor before a storm. The first thing she did was open every window. Dry light spilled through the cracked panes, catching the motes that hung like ghosts in the air. The Mercer ranch house had the silence of a long-abandoned chapel. Its stone walls were baked pale and brittle by years of sun, and the wide plank floor groaned under even her smallest step. Caleb lingered near the door, hat in hand, as if unsure how to share the space. He had imagined this moment, bringing home the woman bought with signatures and promises, but in none of those imaginings had she walked through the rooms like she owned the wind itself. This place is dying from the inside, Isobel said, glancing around. Wood needs oiling. Windows need caulk. There are rats nesting in the corner of the pantry. Caleb's mouth tightened. You'll have your hands full then. Her eyes flicked toward him. So will you. She set her valise down and rolled up her sleeves, and the long, slow dismantling of his solitude began. By dawn, she was already in the corral, boots in the dust, hair tied back with a red scrap of cloth that flared like a spark in the morning light. Caleb stood on the porch, coffee in hand, half hidden by shadow as he watched her size up his bay mare. The horse was notorious, mean-spirited, all muscle and fury. But Isobel approached like she was greeting an old friend. Careful, Caleb called. She'll break your teeth if you get close enough. She only learned to fear rough hands, Isobel said without looking back. The mare snorted, pawed the ground. Isobel spoke softly in Spanish, words like water over stone. The horse's ears twitched. Slowly, cautiously, the wild tension leaked out of her stance. When Isobel swung up bareback, the ranch hands paused their work to watch. The mare crow-hopped once, twice, and then settled into a smooth lope beneath her. Caleb felt something in his chest loosen, then tighten again, painfully. He had wanted obedience. What she carried was something else entirely. Defiance braided with grace, and he didn't know what to do with it. The ranch hands didn't know either. By noon, the whispers began. Slurs muttered low, snickers as she walked by. Some spat when her back was turned. They came from places Caleb didn't trust but needed. Men who'd ridden with Texas Rangers during border wars. Men who spoke of killing as if it were fence-mending. Their faces were scorched and hollowed by sun, their morals brittle as old bone. Caleb heard their words but said nothing, not yet. He watched instead, listened, weighed each man's worth like a blade in his hand. That evening, when one of them, a thick-necked cowboy named Riggs, cornered her at the water trough and brushed a hand along her hip, the decision made itself. Isobel spun, fast as a striking snake, and drove her fist into his nose. Bone cracked. Riggs howled, crumpling to the dirt in a spray of blood. Caleb was off the porch in 3 strides. The other hand stepped back as he loomed over Riggs. You bleed on my land again, Caleb said, voice quiet as a knife being unsheathed, and I'll plant you in it. Riggs staggered away, clutching his face. The others scattered without a word. The air smelled of blood and iron and dust settling after a storm. Isobel dipped her hands in the trough and washed them slowly, calmly, though her shoulders trembled faintly. She did not look at Caleb. He did not speak. There was nothing to say. Nights came cold on the high plain, sinking fast after the furnace heat of day. They ate by lantern light at the long table, he at one end, she at the other, silence stretching between them like an unspoken dare. At first, they spoke only of chores, the herd's water rotation, the cracked axle on the supply wagon. But slowly, words ventured further. Caleb told her about the windstorms that could strip the flesh from cattle in an afternoon, about the flood of '79, when the dry river rose like a beast and took his barn, his wife, and his baby girl all in the same night. He said it flatly, like he was reciting someone else's history. But his hands clenched white on the table edge, until his knuckles looked like carved marble. Isobel listened without pity, only stillness. When he finished, she reached for the bottle of rye between them and poured him a shot without asking. Later, she spoke of the Rio Grande country, how she and her father drove longhorns through the mesquite country, sleeping under the sky. How bandits came one night when she was 16, guns blazing and eyes wild with mezcal, and how she crawled through her father's blood to reach the horse line and cut the hobbles. How she rode all night until the stars blurred, her voice did not crack. It rang like tempered steel. Caleb watched her across the wavering lantern light. Something inside him stirred. Part sorrow, part awe, part fear of what it would mean to care again. Days fell into a rhythm. They worked in silence, but it was no longer an empty one. It was the silence of two people carrying their ghosts side by side. She patched fences, mended harness leather, shoveled stalls until her palms bled. He taught her how to read the sky for rain and the cattle for sickness. Sometimes he caught himself looking at her when he shouldn't, when the wind tangled her hair, when her laughter startled the quiet like a startled bird, when she stood at dusk watching the horizon as if measuring the distance back to her dead. She caught him watching, too, and never looked away quickly enough to make him believe it was accidental. The house changed. The air changed. Where once the rooms had felt like mausoleums, now they held faint music. The sound of boots pacing, dishes clinking, an occasional low hum of a tune he didn't recognize. The air smelled of coffee, saddle soap, and wild sage she hung over the doorway to keep out snakes. It was still lonely, but the loneliness had edges now. Not the endless kind that dissolved a man, the kind that made him notice he was alive. One night, when the work was done and the prairie lay black and boundless under the moon, they sat on the porch steps, side by side. The stars were cold pinpricks above. The land whispered in crickets and distant coyotes. "Why did you come here?" Caleb asked softly. Isobel wrapped her shawl tighter. "Because I am tired of running, and because your letter sounded like a man drowning, and I know what that looks like." Caleb stared out at the moonlit range, the herds just faint shapes among the sagebrush. He wanted to speak, to say that he feared he would ruin anything he touched, but his throat locked. Instead, he said, "You ride like you were born on a horse." She smiled, small and fleeting. "I was, and I'll die on one." The wind curled around them, dry and cold, carrying the smell of mesquite. She did not move closer. Neither did he, but something in the space between them shifted. Fragile, invisible, alive. They stayed like that until the stars blurred and the lantern burned out. The wind clawed at the eaves of the silent ranch house, rattling the loose panes like restless bones. In the loft above the stables, moonlight fell in broken bars across a weathered trunk, its brass lock dull with dust, its hinges breathing the faint scent of old gun oil and forgotten days. Isobel had risen before dawn, drawn by an unease she could not name. Caleb had ridden out early, leaving her alone with the low creak of the ranch timbers and the distant whistle of prairie wind. She climbed to the loft, looking for spare blankets, when her boots scuffed against the trunk. Its lock had already been sprung. A hairline crack ran through the wood as though it had been kicked open long ago, then forced closed again. Inside lay a folded blue cavalry jacket, the brass buttons dulled but unmistakable, a saber wrapped in oilcloth, and beneath them bound journals, thin leather-skinned things, edges curled from sweat and time. She hesitated, fingers hovering like a thief's. Then she opened the first journal. The ink had bled with sweat and rain, but the words cut through all the same. Apache encampment at Black Mesa. Orders, burn. Took fire to the lodges at dawn. Resistance fierce. Civilians included. She read until the letters blurred into smears. A child's cradle blackened. A woman shot while running into the river. Caleb's name at the bottom of the page. Isobel shut the book with trembling hands. The room spun. The sunlight spilling through the slats seemed too bright, too clean for the filth the words carried. Her chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. Caleb returned at dusk, boots thudding softly on the porch. The smell of sweat and horse clung to him as he unbuckled his gun belt. She stood in the doorway of the barn, the journal clutched like a weapon. His eyes flicked from her face to the book, and in that flicker, she saw the truth. He knew what she'd found. "You burned them," she whispered. "An entire village." He opened his mouth, but nothing came. "You've sat here feeding strays and mending fences like some penitent saint," she hissed, "while those screams still hang in the smoke behind you." "I was 19, he said, voice raw. "We followed orders." "Orders?" She stepped closer, the words shaking with fury. "You slaughtered children." Caleb's hands trembled as they hung at his sides. "I hear them," he said. Every night for 20 years. I built this place trying to drown them out." Isobel's throat burned. She shoved the journal against his chest, hard enough that it thumped against his ribs. "You can't build peace on bones." She turned and stormed away, boots striking sparks from the hard earth as she saddled her mare. Caleb called her name, but she didn't look back. The horse's hooves pounded into the growing night. Darkness bled over the plains as she rode, the wind whipping her hair like a banner of defiance. The moon rose pale and cold above the jagged rim of the Red Canyon. Shadows reached like broken fingers across the land. Behind her, far back, a single rider's silhouette carved itself against the horizon. Caleb. He pushed his horse hard, lungs burning, praying she wouldn't ride off the canyon rim in her rage. Dust rose in ghostly plumes around his hooves. When at last she reined in, she was perched on a flat outcrop above the canyon, the world yawning away beneath her in silent stone. Her shoulders heaved. Her hands were bloodless on the reins. Caleb dismounted slowly, careful not to startle her. Neither spoke as they built a small fire of brittle sagebrush, its smoke curling white in the starlight. The canyon swallowed their words before they were born. The fire snapped and hissed. Coyotes howled far below, their cries thin as ghosts. The canyon walls glowed faintly in the moonlight like old scars. Caleb stared into the flames. I thought, if I fed the hungry, if I saved more than I took, maybe it would even out, his voice cracked. But it doesn't. It never does. Isobel hugged her knees, eyes reflecting the firelight. They burned my town too, she said quietly. Not soldiers, raiders, I was 13. I hid under the floorboards while my mother, her voice failed. The wind filled the space between them. For a long while, only the fire spoke. Then Caleb said, we were both forged in the same fire. Different battles, same ash. She glanced at him. His face was hollowed by shadow, older than the years should have made him. He met her gaze, and for the first time there was no armor in his eyes, only ruin, and something softer beneath it, like the last light in a dying campfire. I don't know if I can be loved, she whispered. I don't know if I deserve to be, he answered. Silence. The canyon held its breath. Then, without thinking, she reached across the fire and laid her hand over his. Their fingers trembled, but did not pull away. They sat like that until the fire sank into coals, until the stars wheeled silently above them and the cold gnawed through their coats. The canyon walls glimmered like dark red glass, holding their confessions in secret. Far below, the river whispered over stones, winding on toward lands neither of them had seen. For the first time in years, Caleb let the night be quiet. A single cracked bell tolled from the steeple as they rode into town, its mournful clang folding over the dust-choked main street like a funeral knell. Eyes followed them from every boardwalk, every shadowed porch, faces taut with a silence sharper than knives. Isobel sat straight-backed in the saddle, her dark hair braided tightly against the wind, her chin held high though her palms sweated against the reins. The canyon's starlight still clung to her thoughts, fragile as cobweb. Yet here, under the glare of strangers, it felt like it could shatter with a single word. The town had changed in their absence, or perhaps it was only their eyes that had. Two ranch hands outside the blacksmith stopped their hammering to stare. One spat, the glob landing in the dust with a wet hiss. Someone muttered "gringo lover" behind a shutter. Caleb dismounted first, tying his horse at the hitching post. The wooden planks of the boardwalk groaned under his boots as he crossed to her side, offering a hand. She took it. The gesture, small, ordinary, set the street buzzing like a struck hive. Inside the general store, the air was stale with flour dust and kerosene. Isobel gathered coffee, salt, lamp oil, her eyes on her list. When she turned to pay, 3 cowboys blocked the counter. Didn't know Caleb Ward was fond of savage women, one said, grinning wide enough to show the gap where a tooth had been knocked out. Maybe he wants half-breed calves running his fences, another added. Isobel froze. Her hands tightened on the paper-wrapped coffee. The words struck like stones. Caleb's voice cut through the air, low and dangerous. Step aside, the nearest cowboy snorted. Or what? Caleb's hand hovered near the worn walnut grip of his Colt. His eyes were cold iron. Or you won't leave walking. Something in his tone, quiet, flat, made them falter. Boots scuffed. One of them spat near her skirt hem. Then they slunk out, laughter brittle as glass. Isobel let out the breath she had been holding. Caleb paid the shopkeeper without looking at her. His jaw knotted, the muscles in his arm tight as rope. The banker waited on the boardwalk as they stepped outside, his white suit glaring in the sun like bleached bone. Thomas Grady, slick-haired, soft-handed, and smelling faintly of lilac water, watched them with the smile of a man who counted other men's graves as stepping stones. Caleb, he said, voice sweet as spoiled milk. We should talk. They spoke on the shaded porch of the empty saloon, where flies droned over an abandoned glass of beer. I hear the boys are restless, Grady said. tapping ash from a thin cigar. "Word is, you brought yourself back a Mexican bride." Isobel stiffened. Caleb's shoulders squared. "My wife," he said. Grady's smile widened. "Wife? Sure. Pretty thing. Exotic, but men out here, they fear what they don't understand. Some call it pride. I call it profit." He leaned forward. "Sell me your spread. I'll pay fair. Before the bloodline gets tainted and no one will buy." Caleb's teeth flashed. Nothing of a smile in it. "I'd burn the ranch to the dirt first." Grady's eyes cooled. "Be careful, Ward. Land changes hands one way or another. The prairie has a long memory, and it forgets your kind quick." He tipped his hat to Isobel, mockery dripping like honey, and strolled off into the sun. The days after were brittle and tense, like thin ice over dark water. Word spread faster than prairie fire. Men who had once tipped their hats to Caleb now looked away. At the feed store, Isobel heard whispers coil around her like smoke. "Ruining his blood. Witch's eyes. She'll cut his throat in his sleep." She began carrying a knife tucked in her boot, though she prayed she'd never need it. Caleb grew silent. He repaired fences that weren't broken, sharpened tools that were already keen. At night he sat on the porch in the dark, whiskey untouched in his hand, staring at nothing. Isobel watched him from the doorway, the cicadas screaming in the grass, and wondered if he regretted everything. Her, the makeshift vows spoken beneath the cottonwoods, the fragile thread of hope they had begun to spin. The attack came when the world was asleep. Smoke crept first, thin and gray, curling beneath the bedroom door. Then the crackling roar of flames split the night. Caleb was out of bed before his feet touched the floor. "The barn," he choked. "The horses." They ran barefoot across the yard, the cold earth cutting their soles. The barn was a furnace, flames chewing through dry timber, sparks rising like fireflies into the black sky. The horses screamed inside, hooves pounding in blind terror. Caleb wrenched the door latch. Heat blasted him back, singeing his eyebrows. Isobel grabbed a bucket, dashed water along the threshold, then plunged through the smoke. Inside, the air was molten. The rafters groaned, shedding fiery splinters. Isobel fumbled with the halter buckles, coughing so hard she tasted blood. Caleb's silhouette loomed through the smoke, shoulders heaving as he shoved open stalls, slapping haunches to drive the horses out into the night. One by one they fled, wild-eyed, manes blazing with embers. The last stall was blocked by a fallen beam. Caleb braced his shoulder against it, muscles trembling, and heaved. Isobel threw her weight beside him. With a splintering crack, the beam gave way. The mare bolted, singeing their sleeves as she passed. Moments later, the roof caved in with a sound like a dying god. They staggered out into the yard, coughing, skin scorched, clothes streaked with soot. The barn roared behind them, a collapsing pyre. They stood side by side, chests heaving, watching their work and memory turn to blackened ribs against the stars. The fire burned to embers by dawn. Ash coated the earth like snow. The horses huddled near the fence, eyes rolling white. Isobel sat on the ground, hair singed, hands blistered. Caleb sank to his knees beside her, shoulders bowed as if under a great weight. Her breath hitched. "They'll never stop." "No," he said. "They won't." His face was streaked with soot and tears. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a burden or a risk or penance, but as the last piece of something worth saving. "I thought I could keep the world out," he said, voice breaking. "But I can't, and I don't want to. Not if it means shutting you out too." She reached up, touched his smoke-blackened cheek. His hand rose to cover hers, trembling. Around them the prairie was silent, as if holding its breath. A cold wind swept the ash into spirals that danced between their bodies, then vanished into the pale morning light. For the first time, he let himself hold her. They stayed there as the sun climbed, painting the scorched ruins gold. Black crows wheeled overhead, crying against the empty sky. Behind them, the horses stamped and snorted, alive. In the hush after ruin, their hearts beat in the same ragged rhythm. The prairie lay silent under a molten noon, the sky an unbroken vault of white heat, until the first gunshot cracked across the plain, like lightning tearing open the world. Dust rose on the far ridge, fast and low, like a swarm of hornets skimming the earth. Isobel shaded her eyes from the glare. 6 riders, dark shapes growing sharper with each pounding heartbeat. Their laughter carried on the wind like broken glass. Caleb was gone, riding north to the rail depot to sell cattle. He had left at dawn with the chuck wagon and the 2 oldest hands. The ranch had been still then, its silence like a sleeping beast. Now it was a trap. The stable boy, Mateo, barely 12, all elbows and fear, came running from the well. Senora, riders! Isabel's mind snapped taut. Inside! Go! But now! He obeyed, barefoot on the scorched earth, vanishing into the kitchen like a shadow swallowed by the sun. She moved fast, hammered the shutters closed, dragged the heavy table against the door. The Winchester from the mantel felt heavier than it ever had, the steel hot against her palm. The riders swept in with whoops and gunfire, bullets splintering the porch rail. Glass burst inward from the front windows. She dropped to her knees, heart thundering, and fired back. The first shot took a man's shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. The others ducked behind rain barrels and the water trough, returning fire in sharp, cracking bursts. Wood splintered. Dust jumped from the walls like fleas. Time collapsed into flashes of thunder and silence. Smoke curled through the house like ghosts. She reloaded, hands trembling but sure. The journals Caleb had left on his desk fluttered in the wind from the bullet holes, pages whispering of old wars as new ones tore through the walls. A bandit tried the side door. She heard the latch scrape, swung the barrel, and shot through the thin pine. He screamed and dropped out of sight. Mateo whimpered from the root cellar. "Senora, please, stay quiet," she hissed, voice like flint. "Don't come out until I call you." The gunfire slowed, like the riders were listening. Circling. She counted shadows through the cracks. 4 left, then silence. She stood in the center of the room, chest heaving, eyes sweeping. Sweat burned her lashes. The air was hot, metallic with blood and gunpowder. A floorboard creaked behind her. She spun. Too slow. A man lunged through the rear doorway, grabbing her wrist. The rifle clattered from her grip. He slammed her into the wall, breath sour, teeth bared. "Pretty little half-breed," he hissed, pinning her arm. Her knee snapped up hard. He grunted. She wrenched free, seized the iron poker from the hearth, and smashed it across his jaw. He dropped with a strangled cry. More boots pounded outside. She dove behind the overturned table as bullets ripped the doorframe to ribbons. The rifle lay just out of reach, gleaming dully through the smoke, empty, spent. Her fingers closed on air. Far off, through the shriek of cicadas, came the thunder of hooves. One horse, not many, but fast, reckless. A shout. A gunshot. The bandits turned, startled. Then Caleb was in their midst, a black shape against the white sun, dust streaming from his horse's hooves like banners. His rifle cracked once, twice. One man tumbled from the saddle, blood spraying the dry grass. Another bolted for the gate. Caleb's second shot sent him sprawling. The last 2 panicked, wheeled their horses. Caleb rode through them like a storm, Colt in hand, muzzle flashing fire. One screamed, clutching his arm, and fled. The other dropped his gun and galloped south, shrieking curses that dissolved into the wind. Caleb dismounted before his horse had stopped moving, boots hitting the dirt with a thud. His chest heaved, sweat slicking his temples. His eyes found her through the shattered doorway. Isobel stood among the ruin, soot-smeared, blouse torn, hands empty. She trembled, but her spine was unbroken, her gaze steady. A strangled moan rose from the ground. The first man she had shot lay half-conscious by the trough, blood leaking between his fingers. His eyes fluttered open, full of hate and fear. Caleb strode toward him, gun still raised. His face was carved from stone, lips peeled back in something too raw to be rage. "Caleb," she said, stepping toward him. He didn't hear. Or wouldn't, he cocked the hammer. "Caleb," his hand trembled. The man on the ground whimpered, voice breaking. "Please." The wind hissed through the burned grass. "Vengeance won't heal anything," she whispered. "It never did for you. It won't now," the words struck. He froze, eyes squeezing shut. His arms sagged. A long, shuddering breath tore from his chest, and he lowered the gun. The man crawled backward, eyes wide, then staggered and limped into the prairie until he was just a dark speck on the horizon. Silence fell, vast and ringing. The only sound was the rustle of dry grass and the ragged rasp of their breathing. Caleb turned to her, and all the fury drained from him, leaving only ruin and love. His shirt was torn, blood darkening his side where a bullet had grazed him. He swayed. She caught him before he fell. They sank together to the porch steps, her arms around him, his forehead pressed to her shoulder. "I thought I'd come back to find you gone," he said hoarsely. "You almost did," she whispered. "I can't lose you." "You won't." He lifted his head, their faces inches apart, breath mingling, eyes locked. For a long moment, neither moved. The prairie wind curled between them, cool against their fevered skin. Then, gently, he kissed her. It was not wild, nor desperate. It was the trembling of 2 broken things daring to be whole. That evening the sky bled crimson over the plains. Smoke rose in soft ribbons from the shattered fences. Horses grazed, restless but alive. They stood on the porch, fingers intertwined, watching the sun burn itself out against the edge of the world. No words passed between them. None were needed. Snow fell soft as ash across the high desert, draping the broken fence lines and blackened barn like a shroud. The land lay hushed beneath it, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The wind that once screamed across the mesas now whispered, carrying the scent of pine smoke from the cabin chimney and the faint lowing of cattle huddled in the lee of a stone ridge. Caleb knelt by the ruined barn with a hammer in one gloved hand, frost stiffening his beard, nails gritted between his teeth. His knuckles were cracked and raw, the muscles in his shoulders trembling from days of hauling beams through the snow. When he raised his head, breath steaming in the cold, he saw her across the pasture. Isobel was kneeling in the frozen earth, her skirts weighted with ice crystals. She had stripped her gloves off to press seeds into the black soil. Winter rye. She had bartered for the sack in town with the last of her jewelry, and Caleb had raged when he found out, until she silenced him with one quiet sentence. The earth forgives, if we give it reason. She looked up then, wind tugging her dark hair loose from its braid. Their eyes met across the white field, and for the first time in months she smiled. Not the cautious, brittle curve she gave strangers, but something soft, something alive. The ranch was scarred but still breathing. The windows were patched with tin, the corrals mended with scavenged wire, and the smell of burned timber lingered like an old ghost. But inside the cabin there was warmth again. A pot of venison stew simmered low on the stove. A pine bough hung above the door, dusted with frost. Isobel had sewn quilts from the clothes of dead ranch hands, and Caleb found himself sleeping beneath their stitched names each night as if they were watching over him. He carried his mother's ring in his pocket for weeks before speaking. One night, when the storm winds howled like wolves and the stovepipe rattled with the breath of winter, he came to her. She was mending a child's wool coat by the fire, one of the coats they had gathered from the wreckage of a wagon train, saved for when the bunkhouse was full of children someday. Caleb stood silent until she set the needle down and looked at him. "I bought you with money," he said, voice thick as thawing tar. "I'll never forgive myself for that. But if you'll have me, not as payment, not as penance, as my partner." He set the ring in her palm, plain gold, dulled with age, his mother's initials worn almost smooth. Isobel's eyes shimmered like lantern light on river ice. She closed her fingers over the ring and over his calloused hand beneath it. "I'll marry you," she whispered. "But only if this land is ours, equally, and only if we make it something worth the bleeding." By Christmas, the bunkhouse was full of children. They came from the ruins of burned-out border towns, from orphan trains rattling out of Texas, from cavalry camps where the graves were too shallow to hold the past. Mexican, Lakota, Irish, no one asked and no one cared. Isobel fed them stew and taught them letters. Caleb taught them to ride, to mend fences, to speak the language of cattle and wind. The ranch no longer echoed with silence. It rang with the shrill laughter of the once forgotten. It was that laughter Grady and his men heard as they rode in under a bruised January sky. They came 7 deep, rifles slung low, boots crunching through the snow. Grady sat tall in his saddle, lips curled in a wolf's smile, eyes bloodshot with rage and whiskey. "You think you can spit in my eye and take what's mine?" he called. "This land belongs to men, not charity cases and whores." Caleb stepped down from the porch, rifle at his side but muzzle low. He could feel the old fury boiling, the beast in his chest begging to be loosed. But then the cabin door opened behind him, and the women of the town stepped out. Widows of soldiers, seamstresses with rifles slung over their shawled shoulders, Mexican mothers who had buried sons in cavalry graves. All of them stood shoulder to shoulder before the porch, snow rising to their ankles, eyes like cold iron. Isobel stood in front, shotgun cradled across her arms. Her braid hung down her back like black rope. "This ranch belongs to whoever defends it," she said, voice flat as the frozen earth. Grady's horse danced sideways under him. His men shifted, muttering. None raised a gun. The wind moaned through the cottonwoods, shaking loose pale flakes that spiraled between the two lines like falling ashes. Grady spat into the snow. "This ain't finished," he snarled, but his voice was hollow now. He jerked his reins and turned away, his gang trailing him like whipped dogs into the gray horizon. That night, silence returned to the ranch, but it was the good kind. the kind that hummed with peace instead of waiting for blood. Caleb saddled the bay mare and held his hand out to her. Isobel climbed up behind him, pressing her cheek between his shoulder blades. The moon rose over the hills, silver on the snowfields. The wind smelled of pine and horses and far-off river ice. They rode the pasture in wide, slow arcs, the children's lanterns glowing warm in the bunkhouse behind them, the cabin chimney smoking steady. Two scarred souls, once broken, once lost, riding out together not to escape the world, but to rebuild it. And as the wind combed the snow flat behind them, their tracks blurred until they were one. That was my story. If it reached you, tell me what you felt. Don't let silence bury us again. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and tell me where in the world you're listening from.